told Mark I really wanted him to come because in talking about Subaru, we're talking about the two of us, because Mark, 30 years ago, was president of the Greater Lafayette Progress, Inc. Mark was the key community representative on that project. And I, at the time, was director of Indiana's Japan office, and I was the lead state representative working with the Subaru and then Isuzu team also in Japan. And so Mark and I were in daily communication, and that was before email. I think we sent telexes to begin with, and then faxes. But so I'm glad that Mark could join me. But I can't tell you how proud I am to drive up and down 65, going to Chicago and back and elsewhere, and looking at that plant. And today when I came here, I got off on State Road 38 to come into town and drove past that new addition, the new Subaru place. Is that the paint shop? I thought so. Man, how impressive. And Mark said that he ran into Tom Easterday recently. What are the numbers now?
They're at roughly 5,000 employees, and they're going to make 400,000 vehicles a year there. That's a lot.
I have to tell you a little backstory. I was living and working in Tokyo when I was hired by the state of Indiana in March of 1983 to become director of the East Asian office of the Indiana Department of Commerce. Of course, then it was Governor Bob Orr, Lieutenant Governor John Mutz. Soon after being hired in Tokyo, I came to Indianapolis on a business trip. And the governor and lieutenant governor sat me down and they said, Larry, we have to give hope to Indiana communities. We have just emerged from a terrible recession, the late 70s, early 80s. Things are tough. We have double-digit unemployment. Anderson, Indiana, at that time, led the U.S. with 20% unemployment. There was double-digit inflation. There were lines for gasoline. No U.S. companies were making investments. It was doom and gloom. But the governor and lieutenant governor said, let's work to give hope to Indiana communities. And Larry, we think Japanese companies have money. We think Japanese companies will have to come to the United States and establish factories here. And we want them to come to Indiana. And they said there are 3 reasons for this. Number 1, we want to provide new job opportunities for Hoosiers because there aren't any now. Secondly, we want to increase the tax base of many Indiana communities around the state by bringing in these companies who will build these factories. And thirdly, they said, we want to bring that new technology here and not lose it to Illinois or Michigan or Ohio or Kentucky. So they said, let's work together and get this done. And they were true to their word, and their vision, boy, in hindsight, their vision was so accurate. At the time that I was hired, there were maybe 18 Japanese companies here in Indiana. Half were manufacturing, half were sales or distribution offices. They had been here since the 60s or 70s. I was the second director of Indiana's Japan office, and as I came in, the outgoing first director said that he was working on this big project. It turned out in June of 1983 that Sony Corporation announced that after doing a study of all lower 48 states, they were selecting Indiana and Terre Haute to be the site of the first CD factory in the United States for Sony. Now back then we weren't quite sure what a CD was. We thought, well, it's Sony, it must really be good. It's funny how that worked. But when Sony made that announcement, that was extremely big news in Japan. It was big news in the U.S., and it really helped me in marketing Indiana as Japanese became more aware of what and where Indiana is. Fast forwarding to today, as Taka mentioned, today, fortunately, Indiana is home to close to 260 Japanese companies. On a per capita basis, Indiana is the leading state for Japanese investment. Those companies collectively employ over 52,000 Hoosiers now. And the dollar investment, as Taka mentioned, is well over $10 billion and counting. Another distinction, I have my iced tea markers there. Thanks. Another distinction for Indiana is that we are the only state that has 3 separate Japanese auto manufacturers. Of course, Subaru here. We have Honda in Greensburg and Toyota in Princeton. Now I have to tell you, you know the success that Mark and I had in bringing Subaru here, but we worked on several other projects before Subaru came that looked at that very same site where Subaru is now. And we showed that to the Mitsubishi Chrysler team and to Toyota.
And we failed at both.
Well, we were the bridesmaids in those 2 projects. How fortunate when Subaru and Isuzu came along. And if you folks remember, in the very early days, it was really the Isuzu side of that joint venture that had the most robust sales and really kept the plant going. You remember Joe Isuzu and those commercials? That was very effective. And in those very early days, I don't know, Subaru's models and things that just didn't click with people. But then fortunes kind of did a topsy-turvy thing. Isuzu went down and Subaru came up. And Subaru has been up ever since. And boy, are their sales robust, and are they doing well, and how fortunate they chose to come here. So that's our story. And I guess my only regret in all of this is that economic development does not produce a residual income.
No.
If it did, we would be, well off. So that's part of my story today, to tell you about that history, how fortunate really this community is to have a quality company like Subaru. And the future is really bright, and I'm really encouraged by that. As a result of Subaru coming here, of course, the communities became sister city with Ota City, where Subaru's factory in Japan is. And I know there have been numerous exchanges between the 2 sister cities, and that's wonderful. And now you have a sister club coming up with Tokyo. That's exciting.
Yeah.
When I heard that last night, I was thinking of all the opportunities that will present for people going there, for their people coming here, really opening up new bridges and avenues of communication. I think that's really exciting. Congratulations. Switching gears for a moment, I mentioned to Taka that there's a very important historical figure from Lafayette who was integral in the development of Japan's Ministry of Finance that no one in Indiana knows about. And about 28 years ago, I got a call here in Indiana from a state senator that I knew, and his occupation outside of the legislature was that he was an antique dealer. And he said, "Larry, I've got something here, and I know you deal with Asia." He says, "I'm not sure what this is. Would you come look at it?" So I went to his office, and in this cardboard box, he had these 2 leather-bound albums. And one in particular, on the cover of it, it was initial GBW in Japan. And I started looking through this and understood pretty quickly the ramifications of what this album and these documents were. Did anyone here see the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise? Well, of course, that's a fictional story, but enveloped in a true historical period, because Japan from 1600 closed its doors to the outside world and had a self-imposed isolation. No one was allowed to go out of Japan, no one allowed to come in. And they did that after seeing what happened to China. When foreign missionaries went into China, they were soon followed by the military powers of each of the countries, and eventually that weakened China, and the Japanese saw this and said, no, we don't want that to happen here. So they closed their doors, and this went on for 268 years, from 1600 to 1868. Now, the Japanese are pragmatic. They built a man-made island in the harbor of Nagasaki, and they allowed Dutch ships to come into that island and trade goods with them. And that's how firearms were introduced to Japan, and many food items that the Japanese still enjoy today. When Emperor Meiji came into power in 1868, and the doors of this self-imposed isolation were thrown open, the Japanese, looking at the rest of the world, realized how far behind Japan was. And in the movie The Last Samurai, Tom Cruise portrays a U.S. military advisor who is brought to Japan by the Meiji government to help them train Japan's modern militia. That's what that storyline is about. But there happened to be a man from Lafayette who, during the Civil War, became a general. His name was General George B. Williams. The B stood for Burchell, George Burchell Williams. And he was involved with the IRS. He ended up in Washington after the war as a very senior official of the Internal Revenue Service, just about the time that Emperor Meiji came into power. And the Japanese government asked the U.S. government if they would recommend somebody to go to Japan and advise the Japanese on the formation of Japan's Ministry of Finance. And this General George B. Williams was recommended by the President and other important people in Washington. And so he went to Japan and played a pivotal role in helping Japan and their modern government create their Ministry of Finance. Let me read to you I'm going to read to you the obituary of General George B. Williams that was on the first page of the Lafayette Journal and Courier newspaper on March 16th, 1912. It says, General B. Williams, George B. Williams, dies at Washington. Veteran diplomat and financial expert, formerly was a resident of Lafayette. He was decorated by the rulers of Turkey and Japan. close friend of many presidents, and prominent in political and diplomatic circles, Williams' body will be brought here for burial. Telegrams were received from Washington, D.C. this morning announcing the death of George Burchell Williams, formerly of Lafayette, which occurred at his home in the national capital last night. The news of the death of Mr. Williams caused deep regret here. He was one of the most prominent men in Washington and had been for many years a well-known figure in political and diplomatic circles. Although he had not lived in this city for nearly 40 years, he retained his interest in the affairs of Lafayette and always regarded this city as his old home. Mr. Williams was best known as a diplomat, a trusted agent of the United States government, and a financial expert of high degree. He was a resident of this city for about 25 years. His brother, the late Honorable John S. Williams, having founded the Sunday Times here, and later having been auditor of the United States Treasury. The death of George B. Williams removes from the political and diplomatic life of Washington one of its leading figures. For many years he had been prominent in such affairs. He was born in Lockport, New York in 1842 and came to Lafayette in 1858. Before coming here, he attended the Lockport Union Academy. He learned the printer's trade and was always proud of the fact that he belonged to the craft. During his residence in Lafayette, Mr. Williams was prominent in politics, and he was a prime mover in the organization of the Lincoln Club of this city, a charter member of the club. He was for many years associated with Lafayette businessmen and had a wide acquaintance here. By all who knew him, he was held in the very highest esteem, and his friendship was greatly valued by all. In 1867, he was appointed supervisor of internal revenue in Indiana, and in 1870, he was made deputy commissioner of internal revenue with headquarters in Washington. He was very distinguished abroad. It was this appointment with the Internal Revenue Service in Washington that took him to the national capital. And while he did not immediately give up his residence here, he had spent nearly all of his life since then in Washington. In 1870, he was selected by the Emperor of Japan as financial advisor of the Japanese government. In 1872 and again in 1876, he was special commissioner of Japan to Europe in connection with financial matters. He was decorated by the Emperor of Japan with the Order of the Rising Sun, and later by the Sultan of Turkey with the Order of the Osmanlis. His work as financial expert attracted the attention of the entire civilized world, and he had a worldwide acquaintance and reputation. His close association with the rulers of many lands gave him a valuable insight into the financial systems of the world, and he was regarded as the best informed man on international finances in the world. He was a warm friend of many presidents of the United States. So you can imagine my surprise as I look through his albums, and in them he has many documents, the original letter from the legation of Japan in Washington inviting him to be an advisor to Japan, and the name cards of all the famous Japanese politicians and pictures, and it goes on and on. What a rare historical figure. I don't believe in coincidences, and it's always intrigued me why this came to me. I ended up finally purchasing these albums from the man who had contacted me, and I've shown them to many Japanese diplomats and others over the years. But I have to find a good way to bring General Williams and his life to the attention of more Hoosiers, and I'm always thinking about that. But I wanted to share that with you today. Someone that no one knows about, but we should. So, if anyone has any questions about Indiana and Japan, I would be happy to try and answer them. Sir?
Okay, so when you're competing for business to have investment in a state, you're competing with all the other states for the business generally. What's the main selling point that you go to other places to tell about Indiana that it would be far and above a selling point over what other states could be?
We're really fortunate. Today, and I get asked this often, and I was just in Japan in February and had the chance of participating in some investment seminars. Today, Indiana is the only state in the Midwest with a positive budget surplus.
Yeah.
We are the only state that has a AAA bond rating. We are the only state that's lowering its corporate taxes. We have a citizen legislature, which I think is a positive thing in comparison to other states. We hail ourselves as the crossroads of America, and we have this wonderful location where from any destination in Indiana, you're within 80% of the population of the United States within a day's trucking time. But we've always had a very pro-business atmosphere here.
I like to say that you have to have the site or the building that somebody's interested in. You have to have a quality people that people want to be here, okay? And I think part of that also then has to reflect that we have absolutely first-class educational system here, whether it's K-12 or Purdue, okay? And Ivy Tech, I'm not ignoring Ivy Tech, okay? And you have to have all of those things, plus the cost of living, the utilities, the taxes, all the rest of the sorts of stuff. And if you fall down on any of those, then you lose, because it's that competitive. You have to be good or excellent in every objective measure, or else you get excluded.
Mention what you put in your note to Subaru.
I came back into possession 25 years after it of the original proposal that I wrote to the Subaru people. And the cover letter, the core paragraph in it said was basically, we have no idea what the problems are going to be, but Jim Reilly, remember that name? Okay. The county commissioners, remember them? Okay. Mark Davis, Jim Shook, Sr., know that name locally here? Okay. Bob Witzel, Lafayette Life Insurance, remember that name? Okay. We pledge our good faith efforts to solve whatever problems come up. And I really think that pledging our good faith efforts to solve whatever the problems were made an impact on them. Because it was a scary time for them and for us, because none of us really knew what all the problems were going to be. And let me tell you, there were problems.
Yeah.
So.
On one of the visits that the combined Subaru-Isuzu team made to this community, we had a luncheon. And we asked one of the county commissioners, is that Eugene Moore? Is that his name? We asked Eugene, who was what, then 75-year-old farmer, if he would say some greetings. And Mark and I and the rest of the state and community teams, we had high expectations that Mr. Moore would go into flowery welcome and, so on. He stood up, he said, welcome, come back. And he sat down. And we all went, ah! Ah! You have to.
The guy named Masamitsu, who was the number 2 person at the plant, was sitting next to me, okay? And Japanese, you don't invade their personal space, okay? They're just so crowded, they have very high sense of personal space. He reached over, slapped me on the leg and said, best speech of entire trip.
I love that story. Best speech ever. There's one other story relate. Taking the project team to the Lafayette Mall, we let everybody off this huge bus. We tell them they have an hour to look around the bus, and the leader, Mr. Yamamoto, comes back soon. Tell them about that.
This was supposed to be double secrets, probation secret, kind of stuff, okay? So what do we have? The state had rented a $480,000 Rockstar bus with a satellite dish on top to haul everybody around. So, we're real low-key and inconspicuous driving around Lafayette. So we get to the mall, and Mr. Sojima, who was one of the top Subaru people, he goes into Penny's and buys a pair of running socks. And it had the little Purdue logo on it. So we're thinking, hey, cool. He's got the message. He wants something that says Purdue on it. Okay. Well, Yamamoto, who I got to know later, says...
Who was going to be the president.
Who was going to be the president, although I didn't know that at the time. Looks at me and says, Davis-san. I go, hi. Which means, yes, Mr. Yamamoto. Davis-san, hi. Liquor store? Think about it. Is there a liquor store at the mall?
No.
Yes, there is. Osco was there, and he went into Osco and bought the friggin' store out because they drunk all the booze on the bus and all the booze at the hotel, and he had to restock the place. He came out with about $200 worth of booze that he was carrying. He looks over at me and he says, shopping done.
Now, we wondered about that at the time, and then subsequently found out that when their team was in Kentucky, they were at some community, and Mr. Yamamoto, who was to be the president of the plant, tried to order a beer, and they were in a dry county. So the final test for this community was for Mr. Yamamoto to be able to buy some alcohol here. Then it was okay to come here. So those are just a few of the stories, but how fortunate we were that they did come here. And Japanese projects continue to come to Indiana. The automotive sector, as you know, is extremely vibrant. Things are happening. The terrible calamities in Japan 5 years ago and earlier this year in southern Japan with the earthquakes there have sent a very clear message to Japanese firms that they can't only be in Japan, that they can't have all of their eggs in one basket. They need to get overseas and to be safe. And one of the results of the terrible earthquake, tidal wave, and the nuclear reactor meltdown 5 years ago was that several automotive suppliers were completely destroyed. And those suppliers had been sole source suppliers to GM, to Toyota, some other firms, and shut down GM and Toyota. That will never be allowed to happen again. So a clear message that came out of that was you never are going to have one company only making a component for you. And you don't want them 7,000 miles away from you. You want them closer. So I predict we'll see more and more investment here. We'll see more and more expansions at plants like Subaru. So the future is very robust. Thank you very much.